If you are just joining us on Facebook, I'm Lauren Van Hemert, and I'm with Nicole Brewer. And I really wanted to chat with Nicole because I took your workshop, your anti racist theater workshop at SETC. And I told you a few seconds ago, but I think I told you that day too. Hands down, best workshop I've ever attended. The material was so good and you are such a good presenter. So I want everyone to bring you to Raleigh and Durham in this area and do your workshop. So that's my ulterior motives for this.
Thank you so much.
um, your workshop at SETC and a lot of your work is about anti-racist theater. So can we start with what anti-racist theater is?
Yeah. I also just want to back up and say hello to
Oh,
the people that are watching. And I didn't get a chance on the Zoom to change my name to add my pronouns for hers.
so Nicole, hang on. I'm going to stop you because now the sound is crackly. I think it might be better without headphones, maybe.
Okay, I'm gonna take my headphones off.
Okay, sorry everyone. Just, love Zoom.
Hey, Lauren, how's that
Okay,
sound?
much better, much better. Okay, so yes,
I have
tell us who you
crackliest
are.
headphones, and I'm saving to buy more, so just want to honor that. Yeah. So just wanted to say I didn't have an opportunity to just kind of change my name to she, her, hers in terms of honoring my pronouns and just letting you know that I'm calling in from Yamasee and Muskogee lands. This is also known as Savannah, Georgia. So part of that, I think I'm answering your question as you're saying, like, what is anti-racist theater? And I think part of that is helping to create these longer memories around where we find ourselves and how that history impacts where we are right now, that this isn't anything new, that these are very old and insidious structures that were built and designed to uplift whiteness, but at the cost of genocide, at the cost of, right, people being on the bottom, so to speak. So that land acknowledgement is around my own personal ethos of just stolen land, stolen people. And then, my pronouns, wanting to make space for these various identities. I'm just doing it right now. She, her, and put those on there. Otherwise, it was going to bother me. Great. Well, in particular, when we talk about like anti-racist theater, it wasn't a thing. So I had to come up with my own definition. And so what I've defined anti-racist theater as is practices and policies that actively acknowledge and interrogate racism, anti-Blackness, and other discriminatory practices, promoting, right, anti-racist ideas, values, and policies that counter the oppression of any people during the education or the production of theater. And so with that, anti-racist theater is practiced in reciprocity with other anti-oppressive values, right? Creating space for dismantling a myriad of oppressive constructs: ableism, paternalism, gender and sexual orientation discrimination, bias of indigenous peoples, patriarchy, sexism, and more.
A lot of the discriminatory practices stem from our theater training programs and our education system, which was something I took away from your workshop at SETC. Can you talk about your own experience, your own theater education, your own collegiate experience, and how the work you're doing now stemmed out of that?
Yeah. I had the privilege of attending Howard University for my undergraduate degree. So I graduated with a BFA in acting, HU, for those people out there who are watching this on Facebook Live, always representing. And that experience was one that I didn't know the racism that was being upheld in the program because I was surrounded by Black people. So what I'm talking about is specifically the methodologies. So the Stanislavski, right, the Linklater, like all of these various methodologies and pedagogies that I was being taught were white in the acting program. Really, where those began to shift and change were in the theater history and the play analysis classes, where those professors did not start with the Greeks. They went millennia before that. We were looking at Egyptian culture and rituals and things like that. So I had a foundation that I did belong in theater, that there were parts of Blackness that appeared and were celebrated and important, right, to theater. And when I went to graduate school, which I then attended a predominantly white institution because there is no MFA acting program at a historic Black college in the United States, which is a travesty. That I began to like raise my hand and ask questions about why Black people weren't being represented at that time. And that really caused a lot of friction with my professors who actually just had a gap in their knowledge. They simply didn't know that they were upholding white supremacy in the educational model, that they were upholding bias, like the fact that I didn't have a lead role while I was there until my thesis project, when I was required to have one. And even then they had me play a white woman. So I began to like think about the trauma that I experienced in graduate school and began to think about different ways that theater could happen, that the education of theater could happen without having to oppress people's identities. So it started for me with race, and it has grown to be looking at the ways in which we invisibilize disabled artists, the way we invisibilize trans artists, the way we invisibilize, right, caregivers, because I'm also a board member of PAL, stands for the Parent Artist Advocacy League, right? So just looking at all these kinds of intersections of the way that the theater industrial complex was built to reward burnout, whiteness, and everybody else is like the labor used to fund these structures, and enough is enough.
And I think that's what we're seeing right now from so many artists and from some theater companies. But definitely a lot of artists are speaking out, and that makes me happy. I'm also concerned though, because it's very difficult to create safe space to have these conversations and speak out. And I know there's a lot of artists afraid to speak out. I've spoken to some of them off camera, off the record, because they're afraid of being blacklisted. They're afraid of not working in an industry they love. They're afraid of not being able to do the work. I I guess what is your response to that? What is your response? I know you started a website called Report Racism in Theater. And so I guess how are you supporting those artists who might be afraid?
Well, I think you hit a lot of key areas. And I want to just say that these areas, like the fear is justified, that the retribution and the retaliation that happens even as you're saying, like these conversations that you have happening off camera, that retribution and that retaliation happens off camera. It happens when, specifically white people in power who felt uncomfortable that a Black, Indigenous, or POC person, brought to the forefront some of these issues that they were experiencing, when they don't hire them again. Or when they say, you know what, I don't know that I liked so-and-so, or, these types of things that happen that prevent that person from continuing on in their career, simply because they were asking that person or that institution to be accountable to the ways in which they were practicing unwelcome, to the ways in which they weren't allowing them to have a dignified experience, and to the way that they had created a culture, right, of oppression where people weren't able to actually work in a healthy way, right? So I think one of the things that I brought up in the workshop, that was some knowledge gifted to me by labor organizer in Canada, is like really looking at how racism becomes an issue of the workplace, right? A condition of the workplace that needs to be addressed. And that is true in the educational system as well as in the theater industrial complex as far as, you know, producing is concerned. How are we looking at that? So I just want to say it's real. People are afraid because they have watched other people's careers crash and burn. People are afraid because they've been treated um, poorly, and then no accountability held to the people who treated them that way. And so as folks come to this work, like right now, it feels insane to me that so many people are openly speaking out. Like, I don't know if you've noticed on social media, but people are like putting people's names up. They're putting like they are blasting folks out. And I think what is unique about this time is that COVID has allowed theater to close. So people aren't necessarily in that, like, I don't know, this is a hamster wheel. People aren't on that hamster wheel of actually being in the institution and thinking, oh my gosh, I have to protect the institution with my silence so I can continue to work, because they're not working. But they're also discovering that not working is a survivable event in this moment, right? Because I don't want to minimize where people are on that spectrum of making it or surviving, right? But that a large amount of people are. And so they're finding, oh my gosh, this is a moment for me to find my voice, to speak out, to hold these people accountable, right? So the Report Racist Theater website was asking folks to stop sharing that trauma of racism with each other, and it goes nowhere else. So therefore, no change is really happening because we don't, right, as the Black, Indigenous, POC people of this community, don't hold the vast majority of power in a white supremacist structure. So if the white people aren't actually not just not being told, but made accountable, right, of the harm that they are causing folks, then it just stays in our community, stays in our bodies, stays in our stories, stays in our history, and it harms us. And I just thought to myself, no, I'm done giving white people access to my body and to my health and to my spirit. So how do we like aggregate this data and put out a list, a yearly list around the most reported institutions, so that those institutions could be accountable to the work that they're doing?
Well, and I guess that answers my next question, or my next two questions, as to why reporting is so important, because I think it is, and the what you're going to do with the data that you receive. It sounds like you'll have an accountability list, which is important for an industry that's predominantly white, I think.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You know, so and then what comes from that? Because I think shame and shaming people is a useful tool. It's not a tool you want to use all the time, but it can produce some thought. And that's really what I'm asking the people and the organizations that are being reported to really think about and set an intention around, wow, okay, we've been reported. What does that mean for us in actual actions and actual practices and actual protocols? How do we find ourselves back in right relationship, or for the very first time in right relationship with the BIPOC community, and ultimately with ourselves, right? So yeah, that's the hope of people using the website and being able to produce something. And so September, October will be a year of the website being up and able to take that data and put that back out in a public facing way.
And I will share all of the links with folks, your website link, as well as the report racism. I'll share all of the links when we repost this video for folks. In the last week here, locally, and I guess everywhere, but I'm living in my little local bubble here in the Triangle. So locally, regionally, we've seen many theater companies issue solidarity statements. um I think some are getting it, some are getting it right, some are ready to do some work And some of the solidarity statements here haven't been very well received. And then there's other companies who have called me um, to apologize for not issuing their solidarity statements because they're beginning to share ideas with their stakeholders, and a lot of their stakeholders represent marginalized communities, and so those conversations are taking place, but they didn't want to just issue a quick solidarity statement without beginning those conversations, which I appreciate. So what is your feeling about all of these statements of solidarity? Who is are there companies that are kind of getting it and getting it right? Are there companies getting it wrong? And what do companies need to think about and start exploring as they create these statements? Because this isn't a hashtag. This isn't like jump on board and create your solidarity statement. And then when everything opens, go back to your practice as usual. That's not working.
Maybe they should just listen to you, because I think that's exactly right. Right? And I'm just purposely trying to take some time to breathe, because last week for myself was such like, oof, like this was me in any given day, let alone the trajectory of the week. And even as I like emerge into this week, there's such heaviness, that residue of last week. And these bits of moments of joy and pride, but are very bittersweet as I look at my beloved community out protesting during a pandemic, and think about what has yet to come in terms of what does that look like in my own community and people catching COVID-19. So solidarity statements. I'm one that, so this is my teacher side. My teacher side says, if I create one size fits all, then I'm able to set up a rubric that can just be like, bullshit, or that's not good, or it needs to look like this. You didn't hit this mark, this mark, this mark, this mark, this mark. And then this kind of like, I don't know, this is me throwing it away. Sweeping it off, right? And so what I want to say is around the conversations that I am hoping happened around the creation of the solidarity statement, that it wasn't written alone in a vacuum, that people really had to come to themselves, come to their organization, and as much as they possibly could in that moment, step forward in a way that was accountable. So yeah, there's that, but that's just a moment. And so, in order to begin to repair the relationships, to begin to reduce harm, to begin to prevent harm, right, which are the three guiding principles of my work in anti-racist theater that have been taken from social justice and other particular theories around community and activism and fitted for theater, is what do you do next? Right? So how are you actually enacting practices and protocols that dismantle these systems that, collectively the theater industrial complex is racist, right? So how do you do that? How do you begin to not recreate work, but to amplify the work that these communities have already been doing for decades and decades and decades and decades? And I do want to mention, Lauren, I don't know if you've seen it, but the letter that's going around. Yeah. I mean, that letter it just launched at 7 p.m. last night, Eastern Standard Time. That petition already has over 27,000 signatures on it, where people are demanding change in the over 27,000 signatures of people saying, we got to change. And that change can't happen in some visionary statement 10 years from now. That change is long overdue and it needs to happen now. So I think in terms of these, what are great about these statements is that people just put on record what they quote unquote espouse and gives that record, you know, now people can come back to it and go, look how you're not being accountable to these things that you said you were going to do. What are you going to do about that? So I'm hopeful. A few of them got some eye rolls from me. Um, but we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Because it's not a pass. It's not, you put out your solidarity statement and now you get a pass. You still have to do the work. I don't mind meeting people where they are. If you haven't had people of color on your board, I'm okay with that. You can't look backwards, but now what are you going to do to change it? And that's where I think the danger of these solidarity statements is that it's not a hall pass. It's not a pass that you did it. Yay, you check the box. Now you're done. It's there's a lot of work to be done.
So agreed. And I would say too, in like terms of the idea and the bird of Sankofa, or the bird is looking backwards, right? But moving forward, that you take that information and as you continue to make progress forward so that you're not replicating those patterns of harm. So yeah, like, let's get to it. Let's print them all out and let's hold these folks accountable.
One thing I took away, so I'm a journalist. I'm not a theater maker. I'm a writer. I write words. I'd like to think I'm a wordsmith. Some days, on a good day. But one thing I took away from your workshop was the way in which we used coded language, especially in our education system, because many of the examples you gave in the workshop came from the education system. So we could start there. Can you speak to the coded language in your experience that theater companies have used in their mission statements, their casting notices, and some of the common practices that we've seen as the norm up until this moment?
Yeah, diversity. How about that? Diversity is not anti-racism. So when we're talking about that kind of coded language, like what does diversity mean for these organizations that are then upholding racist practices and protocols? So diversity is one of those, for me, very coded languages, because we can see with equity, diversity, inclusion, and access initiatives that people are still off the record telling stories of how they were looked over for raises, how if they're in senior leadership in some of these institutions, maybe they don't have the same office space or access to that. They're not being given pots of money or freedom. They're being, I hate to use this word in this way, in this moment, it's all I can think of, but they're being policed in their job. Their job evaluations and performances are much lower than their white counterparts. There is this expectation, right? So there's the codedness in the language is that you're okay if you assimilate to what our unspoken culture and norms are, which by default is white. And so looking at these ways that you are asking people to forfeit their health, the ways in which we're dangling carrots of opportunity. If you just do this, if you prove yourself to be valuable in this way, if you get enough money coming in through the grants that you're writing that will promote you to this next thing, and then given that opportunity, they take the time to fill a vacant slot with a white person with no transparency around how that happened. So, you know, for me, coded language shows up when we say we're all in this together. But when COVID hit, freelancers were forgotten. these organizations, right? So that's another website. I'm a part of a 4-woman female identifying producing team for freelanceartistresource.com. And it was around just crowdsourcing all of this information to help freelance artists get through COVID, to know that they weren't alone. Because sometimes it can feel like such an individual hustle or grind, right? That people cared. So I would say for me, that in itself makes me cringe when I think about diversity and what that really means in these organizations, based on the relationships that I have with people across this country and in the UK. They ain't doing no better over there. So I work as an anti-racist theater consultant in the UK as well. And they are facing very, very similar situations with upholding white supremacy there as well.
Are there countries that are doing better than the United States, than the UK when it comes to this work? Because you've taught all over the world, so you've brought the message everywhere. So what are there countries that are getting it right, doing it better?
Well, I would say really I'm based in the UK and here, right, and home. So those are the places where I have like relationships with, and I know people, and I have a history of what's going on. Though my work, because I'm a writer like you, has traveled far beyond where I could hope to even hit on my own 2 feet, right? But I would say let's bring it back home, right, to Turtle Island, to the United States, and look at the work that's happening in Black, Indigenous, and POC-run theaters, and how those theaters are really centering the needs of the human over, making money necessarily. And I'm not saying if you're a Black theater that you are in right relationship with people and you don't cause any harm and everything is fine and we should replicate that. But I am saying that these are institutions that have learned to survive and thrive and make excellent, like emotional, connected work to their communities. And they go beyond just telling stories to having programs for youth, to, really opening their spaces up to the community, that we don't have to go far to look at. We just need to look at the people who have always been here, and we need to listen to them, and we need to believe them, and we need to believe them, and we need to believe them when they say it can be done differently.
Okay, so it sounds like going back, diversity is maybe one of those coded words we need to probably think about or eliminate. In your workshop, another word was perfection, that everybody, hands down, I think that collectively we all decided, yep, that's another one has to go. Other words, language we need to, I don't want to say eliminate, because we're not the dictionary police, but need to think about before we throw them around and use those words.
Yeah, I would say words like theater. We need to think about that. That I don't say white theater, but yet I have to say Black theater if that's what I'm going to, or Latinx theater if that's what or Indigenous theater. Like, how come theater gets to just be white without us having to say it or reference it? So even thinking about that word for me, and how loaded that is in unwelcome, or how loaded that is in assimilation, or how loaded that is really important for, I think for me, credentialing is important. What credentials you think someone needs to do the job, especially when you listen to some of these founder stories. And you need to know this from your interview. Like, I listen to some of these founder stories and my mind just like, where someone goes, I didn't know what I was doing. And someone gave me land and a building. and $20,000. And, I built it into a multi-million-dollar thing. And I'm like, why was that okay in the 70s during this land grab thing that was happening that helped to build up the regional theaters and so on and so forth? Why is it okay for you not to have known a damn thing? Or at least that's what you're saying in your story, right? So we can, I don't know, somehow accredit your thing to a singular genius. But it's not okay for, other people not to know and be given those same opportunities to run organizations and to lead, or that we're not actually looking at the work that people do in community with one another, the soft skill work, as work that's necessary to run an organization. So I'm kind of going off onto a tangent, but I'm saying as we're in this moment and we say, hey, we're looking back to go forward, we can't do this anymore, then don't we need people who are already like engaged in futurism? Don't we need people who are visionaries? Don't we need people who don't do the things that you're used to doing because we want them to be different? We want different outcomes. We want to be in right relationship with human beings over money. Right? So one of the things we talked about in the workshop was being relational over transactional. Mm. And how does that show up, right? So that also befuddles me when people who have those qualities and those skills are overlooked for folks who are credentialed in ways that we know cause harm, that put us in this situation where we put all this money and effort into a system that has collapsed in this pandemic. And so we need to be looking at, if another pandemic hits, how has theater restructured itself to be a part of its community? And in right relationship and reciprocity with those communities so that it can just be nimble in its pivot and settle into a different role. Some of these big institutions, it's just like that's me turning. And people need folks to go like this and get stuff done. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with that.
I feel like the cultural norms that built a lot of our theater institutions that center around whiteness, the way I understand it, and you can totally call me out and tell me I'm wrong because this is a safe space. That's part of the term. This is where I'm trying to educate myself, but one term I keep hearing is microaggression. And that's a term that I'm trying to understand. And as I come from a curious place and try to understand what a lot of the terminology means and how that's built into the very foundations that we put out there, is that what microaggression is? This cultural norm that we've built our theater industry on, that centers around this idea of whiteness or privilege?
Yeah, microaggressions are all the little ways in which your prejudice and biases come out. They come out to play. So I'll give some examples. So in the last 12 days, I've received more than usual text messages from white friends. Are you okay? No need to respond. That for me is an example of a microaggression. It's not about me. It's about them. How are you asking me how I am, but that I don't need to respond? How can you find out what I need? How can you find out where I am emotionally, right? That's about you. In the moments of, creating these letters, but not naming people who may have helped you to realize that you were a racist institution, ways in which we just undercut, ways in which, I'm saying we, and I shouldn't, ways in which others are undercutting, right? And making people feel, even in these unspoken ways, some ways are spoken, that you're an outsider, that you don't belong, or that you're there on some premise other than your own brilliance and genius and spirit. that you're there for something else. So I think, yeah, in terms of microaggressions, I've heard some people describe it as like 1,000 little cuts, like a death by 1,000 little cuts. It shows up in that way. Sometimes it's, at the beginning, it doesn't even, feels like 10 years ago, but at the beginning of this year, I did a production, I directed a production at Catholic University. And it was kind of like looking at the ways in which meetings were happening before I walked into the room, decisions being made before I walked into the room, faculty not coming to like sit in rehearsals and show their support for the work that was happening. Like these are all these little ways of letting me know, right, that I'm not truly welcomed in this space or appreciated or even wanted in many of cases, which is fine. That was such a horrible experience. I would never go back to that department anyway. So yeah, I don't know if that's useful for you, but it's just like, it's all of those things that add up to you feeling a little gaslit, right? Like, is it me? Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying, because I think there's a lot of terminology and words being presented and I don't want to say thrown out, but used. And for me, as somebody, and I hate the word allies, so we're going to get to that word in a minute. But for me, trying to educate myself, trying to understand where these systems come from and how I can be a better advocate, better friend, better sister. Somebody said to me last week, I don't want you to be my ally. I want you to be my sister, because if we're family, we can fight and we can disagree and we can have these conversations that are tough, and then we can still break bread together and still love each other. And I love that. So I guess let me ask you about the word ally. Let's get to ally, because I'm hearing from a lot of my white friends and colleagues, they want to be a good ally. So what does being an ally look like? And is that another word we need to reframe?
Those kinds of words for me, to be quite honest, I don't give a shit. If you call yourself an ally, a sister, an accomplice, that doesn't matter to me. What matters to me are your actions and how you show up and how you have an analysis around your own set of privileges that you may be leaving on the table in order to buy into this capitalistic white supremacist structure, right? And so naming that perfectionism and walking away from that and saying, oh my gosh, I'm going to speak from the I here. I mess up all the time. I do things that harm people all the time. And when it's brought to my attention, it doesn't feel good to be called in. Speaking from my I, like I always just kind of, but I have to remind myself to breathe. I have to remind myself that it is a courageous act for this person to even name how what I did impacted them. And then I got to find my way by listening, by possibly asking, what do I need to do to fix it or correct it? Or just naming how I won't do that again, or for them to continue to come to me if it not sinking in and I do it again, right? So in terms of white people, if you're going to call yourself, an anti-racist, then you got to know that you are in it. Just as though, you can't peel off your white skin, go hang it up and become some other skin color for the day. That's what's important to me. The white people that understand that when it gets hard and when it gets rough and when people are railing at you because there's so much trauma and there is so much harm and there is so much mistrust based on our history as a country. So now I'm just talking about the United States of America, again, founded on genocide, founded on stealing land, founding on indigenous erasure. founded on free labor, and then have those things ignored for so long, and to have those things gaslit for so long, that we find ourselves in this period of history where people are able to talk about these things without a cross burning in their yard, without being killed, right? But we still have people who are talking about these things and being trolled, who are like feeling unsafe where they're at, that we're able to really go, listen, you can't dip out when it gets hard. You have to keep your feet to the fire. You have to keep telling yourself that narrative that makes you afraid, that narrative, that thing that you think, oh my God, I'm going to lose my job, or oh my God, I don't know what to do, so I'll just stop doing it, and I'll just allow these, communities to continue to carry the brunt of these systems. That stuff actually isn't true. You can find your heart's work and your heart's purpose without having to be, that's my picket sign, Lauren, being the person who's on the front lines with the picket sign. And just like you named your gift of journalism, like, what's your anti-racist theater ethos and I'm not like asking for you to put you on the spot and for you to say it now, but I'm just saying, like, what's your anti-racist theater ethos that then informs your journalism? What informs me when I'm directing? What informs that artistic director at a predominantly white institution, right? To have these structures of being nimble to attend to community needs. What informs how we think about money? What informs around the ways in which we have a theater industrial complex built on undercompensated and uncompensated labor, right? So I don't care if you're an ally, if you're a sister or accomplice. I care if you're in it for our collective liberation. So, that's my personal thing. Now, other people, you'll get on your show and they're not on the fence about it. They've got points of view about either one of those things. But for me, action without works,
Yes.
I just kind of nod at those people and I keep it moving.
And I will say, we created, several Black artists in our area approached me and said, can we use your platform and create a forum to begin to have these conversations? And I said, yes, of course. And they created a group called Theater on Racist Negativity, TORN. And I was amazed at the backlash that they received and the backlash that I received. And at one point this weekend, I was feeling that defeatist attitude that you're talking about, where people just go, oh my word, this is too hard. I'm ready to give up. And my husband actually looked at me and said, okay, self-pity's done. Now put on your big girl pants and get back to work. There's plenty of work to be done. And there is, but it's hard work and people will come at you. And I didn't know, I guess I did know that, but when the daggers start coming, that's when you have to work harder. That's what I'm trying to, and I'm not perfect. I'm figuring it out. It's a work in progress. I keep saying that, but it's I'm encouraged because I don't feel alone either, and that's encouraging. That's one of the reasons I wanted to have these conversations this week, to start opening up the dialogue.
Yeah. Well, you wanted to have it earlier. I was just busy. So I do want to name that, Lord. You asked me immediately. And I was like, hey, I have to go to the UK.
Yeah, I'm leaving on a plane tomorrow. I was like, I'm ready to have the conversation now, but it's okay. One thing I appreciated about your workshop so much is you created this safe space in which to begin to have these really difficult conversations. And these are tough conversations to have. I've heard from my white colleagues that they are afraid of saying the wrong thing, so they are perpetuating their silence. That just gives them permission. It's a good excuse to be silent if you keep saying you're afraid. Um, how can individuals and companies and our institutions begin to create that safe space so these conversations can begin to take place?
Yeah. One thing I want to name too is with white people, when they're afraid to do something, actually, that's not based in reality. So, and I want to say this, like, oh, there'll be some people who are pissed right now, be like, well, I said something and I lost my job. But data and statistically, you'll get hired before I do. So even if you get to that extreme and you lose your job or you have to leave, the likelihood that you would be able to get another job at equal or more pay than me is supported by statistics. So I want to say that too, that when white people are afraid to speak out, that's around discomfort. That's actually not supported in any kind of data around your ability to survive and make a way for yourself or be always in demand in some way, specifically even in the theater industrial complex, where it's so incredibly staggered around white leadership, white throughout the entire companies and education system, those people being there, right? There are folks who didn't even know that there are Black professors because all they've had are white ones, you know what I mean? So one, breathe, not gaslighting your experience in any way, shape, or form. It probably sucked, whatever happened, but that fear isn't actually based in data. The next thing I would say is companies that are looking to pivot. There are some core basic things that you need to understand, that this is not a zero-sum situation where if you remove yourself from power, then only a BIPOC person, community person, so a Black, Indigenous, or POC person can come into that space and feel that leadership. We're still talking about a decrepit structure that's foundation, right, is racism. Its foundation is white supremacy. So the way that the budget is cut, the people who are invited into work, the stories that are being told, the methodologies that are being expected of people, who gets to direct, who gets to design, all of this stuff, right? If you don't have an anti-racist lens that intersects every single thing that you do, then there's going to be a way that racism persists. There's going to be work to do. So one of the things is to not think that you have to do it on your own. To go out and to hire people. Sure, you could hire me, but I am one person. There are thousands of people out here, facilitators, who are doing this work, who come with a particular lens and a brand. So I would say, just like you're hunting for a doctor, right? Someone who you have connection with, you should be beginning these relationships of putting feelers out for what facilitator you want to work with, someone who is going to be able to support your goals of becoming an anti-racist, multicultural, fully transformed organization. And it can be done. It is a survivable event. It is, do you have the willingness to do it? That's another question, but it can be done.
What does an anti-racist theater landscape look like?
It doesn't look perfect. And it's so deeply, I think, connected to the communities in which these organizations find themselves and or are working with. So that one thing that I always tell people with traveling all around the country is that I'm like, I'm just dropping in. I don't know anything about St. Louis. So you hire me to come into St. Louis, I'm going to give you a real big framework, and you're going to have to pick and choose what is happening in St. Louis and use your own expertise to lead your company and your community and your department in change, right? If you hire me to go to New Jersey, I'm going to say the exact same thing. I'm just dropping in. So in terms of my anti-racist work, there isn't like a checklist where people can become certified in being anti-racist. What is your analysis around racism in this country? What is your anti-racist theater ethos? And how do all of the decisions that you make, especially these decisions around recruiting and retention, money, how people get paid, transparency about money, like I hope after post-COVID that we don't go back to these systems where artistic directors are making six-figure salaries and you've got other people in here who are making $25,000 but are doing the run of the work. Like no more. Should this be the way in which money is being divided, in which power is being heralded? That what are the ways that theaters are thinking so that they can create micro grants? I love what WHAM has done up in the Berkshires and how they give money away. And they're a small theater company. So like, what are all of these different ways in which you have an analysis around the ways things were done, and then you have a vision for how you want to move into the future, and that you create goals for yourself. So something else that we did was around visioning, but making it small so that I'm not creating some goal that's a year out from me accomplishing, and then I get burnt out halfway through, because we as human beings kind of need that reward system, right? But what's the thing I can do immediately in the next 2 days? What's the thing I can do in the next 2 weeks, right? And the next month, and the next, right? So create, this was me eating an elephant. I love my friend who's always, when I'm talking about big ideas, it's like, how do you eat an elephant, Nicole? So yeah, just take that one bite at a time, and be okay with messing up. That's why there's harm prevention, right? That's why there is harm reduction, and that's why there's relationship repair. So you're looking at that particular lens and that analysis around your decisions as well, understanding, expecting that you're going to mess up. And I think the last thing that I would say is lower your expectations. Whatever your expectations are, if they're up here, it's probably utterly ridiculous. So lower your expectations, and remember to breathe and be in experience with one another.
And I think it also, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but have those accountability systems in place to make yourself accountable when you are wrong. You can have permission to be wrong. You just have to have the accountability piece to move forward from that. You know, we learn from our mistakes. So is there an accountability part of this in restructuring our organizations that has to be in place?
Yeah. So when you switch from being relational, being transactional, to relational, you create accountability structures. Because just as you were the example that you gave around someone who said, listen, I want to call you in and I want it to get a little messy, but I want us to have a pathway back to each other. That's a relationship, right? So the accountability is built into these types of healthy relationships with people where you can name the impact, right? And the intention doesn't get more weight than the impact of the work or the impact of the thing that happened. That the impact, because we're in right relationship with each other, where disagreements happen, gets pushed forward and gets heard and has measures taken to rectify it. So, yeah.
And in that, I think there's, again, maybe I'm wrong, but some trust. There's got to be some that, in building those relationships, there has to be trust.
Mm-hmm.
And
it won't be. It won't be at first. So, trust comes by actions and a whole bunch of other things that have to be happening because it's such an individual thing. I think about something I heard about relationships and marriage specifically. And this older couple supposedly, when asked how they were able to make it to, I don't know, their 60th wedding anniversary, said, we never fell out of love at the same time. And so in terms of trust, you have to understand that trust isn't something that like both people are necessarily giving the exact same amount of at the same time. That those people who have severe trauma and hurt and pain and suffering may be completely closed. I talked about emotional aperture in our workshop. And then the white person might be Care Bear staring the hell out of them with trust, right? And we find that it begins to open and we get this meeting. So just kind of understanding the ebb and flow of trust, what that looks like and how it is not just built, but maintained. And that you can easily degrade or erode trust with a step that, not just a misstep, but a misstep that doesn't attend to the impact, and having accountability to that.
Your training program is called Conscientious Theater Training. I know there's a company locally going through it now, and I love that. So, can you talk about your theater training program, what your workshops look like?
Yeah, the conscientious theater training was built out of my negative experience in graduate school, and all of these little experiments that I then started doing on students when I became an adjunct professor very early on in my career. So, and then I was like, oh, these things actually work. When you center the human being, who knew? When I don't show up in a bullish way. So conscientious theater training, just really quickly, is around cross-cultural collaboration. How we ask people to invite the students to invite their cultural context to the work without pushing it on them. How do we look at the exercises that we're doing and the methodologies that we're presenting? How do we lead from radical transparency? How do we share leadership in these classrooms and these training institutions? How do we honor the brilliance that the students have brought in, which may look very different than the way we were trained to feel and see and understand excellence, right? How do we begin to privilege other languages being spoken into the classroom so that we're not always saying that something has to be done in English, because if I don't understand it, then, and how are we making sure that we're creating brave spaces where people can show up and take those risks and fail, but then also be accountable to the way in which they succeeded in that day, right? So it's not an all or nothing kind of thing. And then also, what are the different modalities of teaching? So the singing circles, the sound circles, musical instruments, like what are these different ways and expansive ways that we can be showing up inside of our classrooms, in our educations with people, that bring in awareness to racism, right? Without having to, like, I don't know, my kids have been watching a lot of Tom and Jerry lately. So this is, I don't know, like a hammer on the cat's head. So that you build responsive teaching structures, supportive relationships, cross-cultural collaboration, and a social justice and diversity awareness to the work that you're doing.
And I will put a link to your website so people can find you, because, like I said, my hope is, and maybe you're not the right fit for every organization, but I want people to, as you said earlier, find the right facilitator for them so that they can begin to do the work. So they can start with your website.
Start with my website, NicoleMBrewer.com, for sure.
And then if a company is truly committed to transforming the culture of their theater organization to anti-racist, what does that first step look like? Where do they start?
I always say, what's your anti-racist theater ethos? It's the easiest thing that you can do, doesn't cost any money, and just requires you to sit down. It's not a novel. It's one sentence or two. What is that? What are your ethos being? Your guiding values and your beliefs. What is your anti-racist theater ethos? Putting that for yourself and then making one for your organization, because they may not be exactly the same.
Well, thank you, Nicole, for your time and for making space to talk to me. I so appreciate it. I'm hoping to have many more of these conversations around this work so that we can use this time that we're in intermission, that we're in this pause, to reflect and change and do better. That's what my hope is, anyway.
Thank you for the invitation, Lauren.
Thank you. And if you came in late, I know there were some people who popped on late. This will live on our Facebook page. You'll also be able to see the video with the links on our website probably tomorrow, because there's a little bit of I can't get the videos rendered fast enough. So they take a long time to render. Probably be tomorrow by the time it gets on the website. But thank you, Nicole, and stay safe and healthy. And I hope to see you in a lot of our theater spaces in Raleigh and Durham in this area soon. And everyone come back. We've got 2 events coming up later at 7 o'clock. There's a pre-recorded conversation that Judy Dove had with Mike Brannon about Goodly Frame Theater's Zoom Fest that's coming up this month. And I will be talking with Madeline Fugate at 8 o'clock about her COVID quilt project. My belief, Nicole, is children are going to change the world. And Madeline is a good representative of that. She's 13 years old, and she's doing some really a great project. So come back for those conversations. Thank you again for your time, and I will see everyone later. Stay safe and healthy.
Same to you. Thanks, Lauren. Bye.